Good evening. I am Rabbi Dr. Meir Muller, Interim Director of Jewish Studies, and I am delighted to see so many familiar faces in the room for this year's Solomon Tenenbaum Lectureship in Jewish Studies. Thank you for being with us. The Solomon Tenenbaum Lectureship has a long history of bringing together scholars, authors, and members of the communities across South Carolina to discuss topics important to the Jewish experience, both locally, nationally, and globally. This series has fostered conversations on Jewish culture, Holocaust remembrance, theology, and more. Tonight, we continue that tradition with our esteemed guest, Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt. The format of the program will be an interview-style conversation with Dean Samuels and Mr. Greenblatt. We are accepting questions from the audience via the note cards you saw in the lobby and you see around you in this room. If you have questions, please jot them down and pass the cards to the end of the row where they will be collected for the question and answer session at the end of the conversation. As a reminder, books are for sale outside of the auditorium, and you are all invited to stay for a book signing and reception after the conversation. And now, it is my honor to introduce the university's 30th president and a real mensch, President Michael Emeritus.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's Solomon Tenenbaum Lecture. And those of you who are not part of the USC community, welcome to our campus. Tonight's conversation with our guest speaker promises to be enlightening and timely, and I'm looking forward to what we can learn from this dialogue that is going to follow. This important lecture series dates back to 1990. It was the inspiration of Midland's leader and philanthropist, Sam Tenenbaum, and Sam is with us tonight. Please recognize him. And of course, Sam doesn't do anything without Inez, so it was Sam and Inez, and also Charleston businessman Melvin Solomon and his wife Judith. Together, they established this lectureship in Jewish Studies at the University of South Carolina as a platform for bringing important voices and ideas into our community. The scholars, authors, thinkers, and visionaries who are invited to participate in this lectureship provide insights into how we can listen, learn, engage, and act to improve our understanding of each other and to build a more thoughtful and compassionate society. Over the years, the Solomon Tenenbaum series has brought to our campus many distinguished guest speakers, including the Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel and the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Thomas Friedman. We are grateful to the Solomon and Tenenbaum families for their vision and commitment in establishing this program, which continues to be a true gift to our university community and to our Columbia community. Tonight, we welcome another distinguished guest, Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, whose mission is to stand against anti-Semitism, bias, hate, and other challenges to the well-being of our democracy and our society. The unsettling title of his book, of his new book, "It Could Happen Here," sounds a warning about the increasing occurrence of disturbing hate-based incidents in our country. But his subtitle, "And How We Can Stop It," actually offers a ray of hope. And I know we'll hear about both of them tonight. As Mr. Greenblatt wrote in a 2020 commentary piece, with a comprehensive whole-of-society effort, we may be able to reverse some of these troubling trends. We're looking forward to hearing and learning from Jonathan's perspective. So with no further delay, I will turn the program over to Joel Samuels, Dean of our College of Arts and Sciences, to begin his conversation with Jonathan Greenblatt.
first of all, thank you all for being here tonight for our Solomon Tenenbaum Lecture, our second of this academic year as we return from the pandemic when we weren't able to be together. Jonathan, it's great to have you here. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Joel.
I thought it would be helpful. So many in our audience will know about the ADL, but if you could maybe just start, because we're going to talk about the book, we're going to talk about the themes the president highlighted, challenges and hope, but maybe by starting with just a little primer about the ADL. If you could.
Sure. I am, first of all, super excited to be here, Joel. Thank you, Mr. President, for the kind introduction. I appreciate it. There are a number of special guests here tonight, and I just want to acknowledge Mayor Rickeman, who I met before. I'm not sure where he is. He's over there, Mr. Mayor. State Representative Beth Bernstein, who I also met earlier today and was here earlier. Oh, hey, Beth. Nice to see you way up there. Joel Lurie, who helped to facilitate my visit. Joel, it's good to see you. It was nice to meet your lovely wife. My friend Bill Stern is here with his wife, Linda. And I want to thank you, Joel, Dean Hubbard. I think there's another dean I might be missing.
Two deans is plenty.
Well, the truth is that really all of you are special guests. So whether you're from the Columbia Jewish Federation or just with the Columbia Jewish community or with USC, thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. So I think, lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the man who's really made all of this possible, Samuel Tenenbaum. Thank you for your commitment to this lecture series. And really to all these issues, Samuel. Thank you. So why don't I give you all a little bit of background on ADL, just to put us all on the same level, so you know a little bit about our organization. So ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in America. It was founded in 1913 in the wake of the Leo Frank incident. Now, I'm guessing some of you might be familiar with the Leo Frank story, being here in the South, but I'll share it for those who aren't familiar. So Leo Frank was a Jewish man from New York who went down to Georgia to manage his family's business. It was a pencil manufacturing business. And at the plant, one night, a young non-Jewish girl was found sexually assaulted and strangled to death in a bathroom in the plant. And they immediately blamed the Jew. Now, this was at a time in 1913, at the turn of the 20th century, when Jews in America faced what we might call today systemic discrimination. There was pervasive bias. Laws kept Jews from buying homes in many parts of the country. Jews were quotas either artificially kept their numbers low at universities or they weren't permitted to enter at all. Many professions wouldn't hire Jews. Many hospitals and medical institutions wouldn't treat Jews. Jews had their own antecedent to the Green Book. So they knew what businesses and restaurants, particularly here in the South, and hotels, they could get service, because many wouldn't serve Jews. And there was rampant slander in the media. So in this environment of hostility, they blamed the Jew, even though there was exculpatory evidence, even though he wasn't there to commit the crime. Nonetheless, he was falsely accused, wrongly convicted in a sham trial, and sentenced to death for the crime. Now, the governor intervened because he didn't have due process and reduced Leo Frank's sentence from the death penalty to life imprisonment. And the mob was so enraged by that act of mercy, they tore Leo Frank from his jail cell and they hung him from a tree. They lynched him. And while the body was still hanging from the rope, the town gathered around and they did a barbecue. And they took pictures of the corpse. And they turned those photographs into postcards, which they gave out as souvenirs. You can still find Leo Frank postcards at some antiquity shops here in the South. And they chopped up the rope and sold pieces of it off as mementos. Now, unfortunately, lynchings of black boys and men, even some women, were part and parcel with a culture here in the South. I know you all know that. But this lynching of Leo Frank galvanized the Jewish community. And the ADL was founded around the trial. And the founders, they wrote a mission statement for ADL. It's a mission statement we still use today. 110 years later, you can still find our mission statement on the wall of every office, of every chapter of this organization across the country. And the words still read that our purpose is to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. Now, just to break that down for a minute, 110 years ago, it made sense that these Jews said, we need to fight for our community. We need to defend our community because they were vulnerable. Their future was uncertain. That made sense. But they added that and said, we will also pursue justice and fair treatment to all. This was a community without a leg to stand on, without the kind of organizational capacity, without the economic resources, without the social standing, that fighting for themselves was ambitious enough, but to also fight for others, that was an audacious, bold, some might say outrageous objective. But you know, it's kind of a very Jewish idea. I would actually argue it's a very American idea. And so this notion of fighting for ourselves and also fighting for others, this recognition that unless everyone has justice, so Jews won't have justice, is a powerful, unifying idea. And it has been the animating force that's coursed through this organization for over a century. So yeah, ADL is the organization that in the 10 and 20s and 30s and 40s exposed those quotas and overturned them, changed those laws, exposed the discrimination, and made America a safer, more inclusive country for its Jewish community. And then in 1947, 48, Dean Hubbard, you'll correct me, I probably got the date wrong, ADL filed its first amicus brief in the Shelley versus Kramer case. That was about restrictive housing covenants that kept blacks and Jews from legally buying homes. And then in 1953, our second amicus brief for the Supreme Court in a case that we now know as Brown versus Board of Education. And when ADL took that position in Brown v. Board of Education, desegregation of America's schools was not a popular position. No one was talking about intersectionality. No one was talking about social justice. But ADL was. And ADL recognized that there was no such thing. There was no such thing as separate but equal. Separate was inherently unequal. The Jews knew that. ADL knew that. And so whether it was the fight for civil rights and equality for black Americans, or the fight for freer immigration, or the fight for LGBTQ equality, ADL has always believed that the fight against hate isn't a Jewish fight, it's everyone's fight. And that justice for all minorities is the only way you get justice for the Jewish minority. So today there's three ways that we do this work. Number one, we protect the community. Number two, we advocate. And number three, we educate. First, we protect. So ADL literally tracks anti-Semitic attitudes and incidents. We've been doing it since the 1960s on the attitudes. We've been doing incidents since the 1970s. And let me tell you, the data isn't good, Joel. Anti-Semitic attitudes, when we started doing this work, 1964, almost 60 years ago, roughly 30% of the US population held classically anti-Semitic attitudes. That number went down and has stayed down for well over a decade until last year. The number was around 11% in 2019. In 2022, 20%. So 20% of the U.S. or the general population now expresses what we would consider strongly held anti-Semitic attitudes. That's almost double the number. We also track incidents, anti-Semitic acts of harassment, vandalism, violence. Now the police track vandalism and violence. We also track bullying, discrimination, harassment. We track that through a network of 25 offices across the country. We track it relentlessly, zealously, and we investigate every incident that's reported to us. In 2021, there were 9,664 incidents, and we verified that 2,717 were anti-Semitic. So those numbers might seem like abstract to you, but let me put it to you like this. 2021 was the highest number of anti-Semitic acts the ADL has ever tracked in 45 years of doing this work. And to put that in perspective, that was triple the number that we had in 2015. So anti-Semitic attitudes have doubled in recent years. Anti-Semitic incidents have tripled in recent years. And let me tell you, when we release the 2022 numbers next month, they will be worse. My prediction. So we track. We are a data-driven, evidence-based organization. And we work every single day with law enforcement to investigate these hate crimes. Now let me tell you, sure, law enforcement absolutely has its issues. We need law enforcement to do better. But law enforcement is our trusted, invaluable partner in protecting the Jewish community and other minorities. And so we train them. We are the largest trainer of law enforcement in the United States on extremism and hate. We train 20,000 officers every year. And we investigate the extremists. We literally, last year, gave almost 2,000 tips to law enforcement, because I've got analysts tracking Facebook and the private web and the dark web, anticipating threats and sharing that information actively. And our tips lead to search warrants, lead to arrests, lead to indictments, lead to prosecutions, lead to sentences. To keep our community, to keep the Jewish, the black, all the different communities safe. So we are very focused every single day on the front lines, keeping communities safe. That's the first thing we do. Second thing is we advocate. We're in Columbia in the state legislature trying to get a hate crime law passed. God willing, Beth Bernstein will help you. We'll get that done. And we're lobbying in state houses across the country, and we're lobbying the U.S. Congress, and we're litigating. Where right now we have a lawsuit against the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. God bless me, if we successful, we'll bankrupt them and put them back in the box where they belong. So we litigate. And then thirdly, we educate. Because at the end of the day, you can't sue your way out of hate. You can't arrest your way out of hate. You've got to change hearts and minds. So we are one of the largest providers in America of anti-hate, anti-bias content in schools. In 2022, ADL reached about 4.5 million school children. And look, we've got to grow that number 10x. We've got to reach 10x the number of law enforcement. We've got to deal with all of this hate if you want to actually give this country to the next generation in as good a shape as we found it. So we've got our work cut out for us.
So many different threads to pull on there. I want to talk about the book for a little bit.
Sure.
The president referenced not only the title, but the subtitle of the book.
Yeah.
Why America is tipping from hate to the unthinkable and how we can stop it. I want to focus on two parts of that. The tipping point piece and the unthinkable piece. What is the tipping point? What do you see as the tipping point? And how did we get here?
So look, the tipping point is it's hard to know what it is, right? It's oftentimes I think hard to know when you're at that crossroads in history. where you walk down this path or this path. We often don't know when that moment is. But like for me, there are a couple moments that felt like tipping points. The sight of Nazis marching through Charlottesville without any guile, out in the open, absolutely no shame. Look, we know what it looks like when they wear hoods and when they wear masks, when they hide behind their keyboards, but to see these people with impunity marching in broad daylight, I was like, that's different. Another moment, I'm in Shabbat on a Saturday morning in my synagogue. Full disclosure, I had my phone with me. Those of you keeping score at home, tell me I shouldn't, but I had it I had it in a bag and in the pew, and it was buzzing. In the middle of services on a Saturday morning. Now, I usually keep it in the car. I had a thing with one of my kids. Doesn't matter. And it was buzzing, like again and again and again. And my wife, she says to me, answer the phone. I'm not going to answer the phone. I'm in synagogue. So it buzzed and it buzzed and it buzzed and it buzzed. So after the service, I took the phone and I went out, I took my Talis bag and I went out to the parking lot. I opened it up and I had all these phone calls. It was the morning of Pittsburgh, October 28th, 2018. Literally 11 people slaughtered in their synagogue while praying on a Saturday morning. That felt like a tipping point. More recently, the sight of, guys with Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts rampaging through the Capitol, beating U.S. Capitol police officers over the head with flagpoles, that felt like a tipping point. So, and then actually, this week, and I talked to a few of you about this, either in the reception earlier today, the governor of one of the most populous states in the Union telling universities what they can and can't teach. The idea that they're pulling books about Roberto Clemente out of the school library. The idea that there are teachers who think in Texas that they need to teach both sides of the Holocaust. So all these little moments, they feel like, data points like or outliers on a scatter plot. But suddenly if you step back, you can start to see there's a trend line here. There's a trend line. It's not a good one, folks. It's not a good one. So I am not, Chicken Little who thinks the sky is falling at every turn. It isn't. I don't think there is a Holocaust around the corner. Nonetheless, if I had sat here with you, Joel, 5 years ago and said, in 5 years' time, the number of anti-Jewish acts will triple in America, you would have said, no way. If I had said to you 5 years ago, we'll have governors across the country with the political will to yank books off the shelf about Rosa Parks, you probably would have said to me, no way. So there are these moments in time which give me great pause. Which one is the tipping point, I'm not sure, but I often feel like we're all frogs in a very large pot of boiling water.
I want to go in a slightly different direction than I planned to based on what you just said, the how we got here. To what extent do you think COVID and that period of sort of isolation has impacted any of this?
It's a good question. So I think these trends started before COVID. But I think COVID exacerbated and intensified things. So when I say these things before COVID, let me be clear about one thing, right? Hate isn't a new phenomenon. Racism isn't a new phenomenon. Anti-Semitism is often described as the oldest hatred. But I think there are reasons why we're seeing this escalation. So number one, I think in recent years, and we saw the spike start in 2016, people in political life have given permission to this kind of stuff. Former presidents, current Congress people, certain entertainers, certain athletes, they say these things, and they've literally weaponized and utilized, they've like instrumentalized is the word, intolerance, and used it for political gain or public attention. Again, without shame. That's new. Look, you had your share of racist politicians here in South Carolina. They're bad apples all over. But what's different today, I can think of a certain nominee, someone who's announced their candidacy for presidency, who made hate a staple of every single public statement he made. It's just true. It's absolutely true. Demonizing, dehumanizing people. Saying things that I wouldn't want my kids to say. So number one, I think people in public life have utilized intolerance. Number two, I think extremists have been emboldened in this environment. We literally know this because at ADL, we track the extremists. And we watch them during debates say things on their private, like WhatsApp channels. We feel emboldened when President Trump says, stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys. They're running for office. And not just, presidency. They're running for school boards, library commissions, election officials. By the way, extremism isn't just a function of one side of the political spectrum. You can get intolerance on all sides. And so there's a sort of Newtonian principle here, Joel. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You got extremes on the right and radicals on the left. It's all scary. Number three, social media. So COVID, where everyone was at home, shuttered in their social distanced lives, everyone was online. But if you ask young people today, this happened with someone at ADL. We're talking about our marketing plan. And I said, well, let's talk about the online marketing plan. She raised her hand. She said, what do you mean? What do you mean online marketing? It's all marketing. For the older people, like 40 and up, we think online and offline. But the younger generation, they're already in the metaverse, folks. They already lead more digital lives than they do in this world. They socialize, they date, they shop, they communicate. They don't talk, they text. And I'm not saying this with judgment, it's just true. And social media is a super spreader of hate. Facebook is the front line in this fight. The disinformation, the misinformation, and the poison being spread on these platforms is more lethal than COVID-19. And it's destabilizing to our democracy, let alone to others around the world. So take those three things together, and then you layer on one last thing, which I think is really, really unfortunate. In a world in which our government seems incapable of anything, in which markets aren't delivering the promise that the next generation hopes for, right? I mean, all the data tells us, the surveys, that young people think they're going to earn less than their parents. When systems fail and the gap between the haves and the have-nots grows, and people are so polarized, you know something. People look for someone to blame. When nothing works, people go for some other explanation. Occam's razor. What's the simple way to make sense of this? And what is the scapegoat across cultures, across countries, that mankind knows to blame? Who is that community? It's the Jews. It's the Jews. So you add together some pretty awful, unrepentant public figures with an emboldened set of extremists and the super spreader of social media in an environment where things are failing. That is a toxic stew.
You're talking about social media. I've gone out of my way to proudly have almost no social media, and yet I realized how much that disengages me from the next generation, from my students in the college, from younger colleagues. It actually isn't a point of pride. You have to sort of be engaged. And then you think about the super spreader piece, not only the connections, but there's almost a performative act at times. You think of Christ Church and other circumstances where you're almost performing for others using social media in those ways. I want to share with the group and with you in our College of Information and Communications here, we have a social media insights lab that does work tracking where you can use different search terms to sort of track corpuses of work and what people are talking, what's trending in Sri Lanka today, what terminology, what if we talk about different things. And being able to do that and the role of the academy in thinking about and working with ADL, working with groups that can do this, I think is just such an essential piece of addressing that.
You're going to have to, I mean, all of you, no matter what line of work you're in, if you're, well, let me reframe. If you are in an information industry, you're a financial wealth advisor, or you're a realtor, or you're a law school dean, you should be thinking about ChatGPT. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Raise your hands. Good. How many of you have used it? So here is your homework assignment. Here is your, can I do that, Dean Hubbard? Joel, is that okay?
As long as you don't use ChatGPT.
Go online now, tonight, not during the talk. Later tonight, next few days, try ChatGPT. It is terrifying. And so in a world in which AI is going to reroute society in ways we can't even imagine, all of us have our work cut out for us. So, by the way, you talk about social media, there's an even bigger issue out there, which is online games. For those of you who don't know, the online gaming industry is larger than Hollywood in terms of its gross receipts. And you might not be playing, Fortnite or Roblox, but I guarantee your kids or your grandkids are, because they all are. And it is like literally sending your children into the mall or the playground with no parents, no security guards, nothing. So in a world in which everything is digitized, Joel, social media is just the start. We've got to rethink all of these systems, which puts an onus on all of us. Those of us who believe in institutions, to adapt ourselves to this new environment.
It's a scary concept. I was doing an interview for my undergraduate alma mater about a month
What's
ago.
That?
I was doing an interview for my undergraduate alma mater,
what alma mater?
Princeton.
Oh.
And
Not bad.
there you go. That's why I said undergraduate alma mater.
It's like the people say I went to school in Boston.
Exactly.
Yeah. I didn't. Well, I sort of did, but not that school.
And I was interviewing a top high school student here in Columbia. And I said, what do you do in your free time? What are your passions? And he said, my primary passion is playing video games. And he prepared for the interview. So he went on to tell me how much video games had taught him about history, that he'd learned about World War I through one of the video games that he had played. And I thought, that is not where you should be learning as much history as they may have built into that game about world wars, right? That is not the space, because it's an undefined space. And it was a scary moment. Your point is really well taken, because it's and then the conversations that are happening.
Yeah, look, in the gaming world, like the social media world, there are no fact checkers. There are no ombudsmen. There are no standards and practices, and there certainly aren't any citations. So, Wikipedia is challenging enough. But again, all of us have to rethink and reimagine how we're going to engage with this, not just the next generation, with all the generations.
Can you talk a little bit?
By the way, this is why ADL opened up a center in Silicon Valley. So we are innovating, and we are meeting the challenge. We opened a center in Silicon Valley in 2017. The woman who runs it is an ex-Facebook executive. And I don't have, with respect, fundraisers from the Jewish Federation of Whereversville there. We have software engineers. We have product managers. We have data scientists. So that when we had issues with Zoom a few years ago, and we did, do you remember the Zoom bombing incident? ADL was the organization. I sat down with the leadership there. And not only said to them, you have a problem, we said, here are some concepts, like some sketches, we call them wireframes. And here's some product recommendations, feature and functionality, how to change it, how to fix it. So we have literally hired people who are from the industry in order to help us fix the industry. Because, again, you got to be in it to win it, and we definitely are.
Well, that leads exactly where I wanted to go. Can you talk a little bit about ADL's formula for dismantling hate? In the book, you talk about a whole of society approach. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like for you?
Yeah. So, and I think the president mentioned this in his kind introduction too. Look, at the end of the day, hate is not something we can end in like a political cycle, right? We're not going to wrap it up in a legislative session. Hate, much like other viruses, requires constant attention, requires inoculation, and it demands a whole of society strategy. That means, yes, we need elected officials to pass the right laws. Yes, we need law enforcement to provide adequate protection. And we need the education system to teach our young people, to inoculate them, to vaccinate them from the venom of hate. And yes, we need businesses and institutions like this one to be teaching about the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's not political. That's a principled thing to do. So, and we need an active, robust civil society where everyone sees the role that they have. So literally, Joel, you asked about COVID-19. Hate is also a bit like a pandemic. And we need to prepare, and we need constant vigilance in order to mitigate it and keep our communities safe.
So one can imagine various responses to different forms of anti-Semitism, racism, hatred. Can you talk about some of the most successful ADL programs? What are some of the outcomes? What are the measurables that you look for?
So I mentioned earlier our anti-bias, anti-hate education programs. We, again, reached 4.5 million kids or so last year. We have a new center of research at ADL. I have a Stanford PhD, it's that other school out on the West Coast. And we're literally, building the mechanisms to do pre and post analysis. Let's look at how our anti-bias education programs actually decrease biased attitudes, to do them immediately afterwards and then like a year or 2 years afterwards to see if it actually sticks. So that's the kind of measurability we look for, right? Do the interventions actually deliver improved results? So number one, we need that on the education side. Number two, law enforcement. We train law enforcement on how to deal with hate crimes to make sure they're reporting them accurately. We're now going back and looking at law enforcement agencies. Are they actually reporting on hate crimes? And what's the percentage that are doing so on a regular, consistent basis? You can only manage what you measure. And still, this is hard to imagine, but in the United States of America, 85% of law enforcement agencies either report 0 hate crimes a year or don't even bother to report at all. 85%. We need to move that number dramatically so we understand the extent of the problem. So I think things that I think about are the efficacy of our interventions, from education programs to training programs, the percent of public institutions participating in this, and then things like the implementation of laws. And here's where I go back to Beth Bernstein and what you need to do here in South Carolina, which is to pass a hate crimes law. You are one of, I think it is, 3 states in the union that doesn't have one. And look, my visit to South Carolina didn't start at the USC Law School. It didn't start in Columbia. It started at Mother Emanuel. And I had the blessing of spending a bit of time with Pastor Manning. And I think about the sacrifice of those 9 people. And I think about that loss. Passing a hate crimes law in this state is the least that we can do to memorialize them and to honor them.
I want to go back to the book for a second. In the book, one of your chapters, you talk about a relationship you built with Damian Patton, a white supremacist turned CEO. Can you talk a little about how that relationship developed, how it has maybe changed your perspective, and any impact it's had on ADL?
It's a great question. So Damien Patton is a very interesting story. So basically it was during COVID. It was the beginning of COVID. I was at home in the work from home mode. And I got a call from a former, like a friend of mine who's a venture capitalist. I worked in Silicon Valley for many years, so I have a network there. And he said, hey, Jonathan, there's a guy I'd like you to meet. I invested in his company, and he just got outed as a white supremacist. I said, really? I said, just give him a call. That man was Damien Patton. So Damien Patton was born and raised in Southern California. Actually, a broken home, Jewish mom. And in that broken home, got involved in gangs at a young age. First Latin gangs, and then white supremacists, like the skinhead movement, which was big in Southern California in the 1980s. Got swept up in this movement, so much so, again, denied his own heritage, that he went to Tennessee to be part of some white supremacist gathering, was in a car as a minor with two members of the Ku Klux Klan who one night in Nashville drove by the main synagogue and shot it up. Now, no one was killed, and they were quickly apprehended. And the two men, adults, they were caught in the act. They were arrested. They were sentenced. They went to jail. Damien Patton was a minor, so he was given probation. And interestingly enough, the FBI spelled his name incorrectly. So why does that matter? Because Damien Patton, again, did probation, immediately went and joined the military, joined the U.S. Navy, and left his white supremacist friends behind and the lifestyle behind. Joined the Navy, served, came back to the U.S., found out he was pretty good at coding, writing code, writing software. Ended up moving to Utah, starting a company called Banjo that did monitoring software. Raised a bunch of venture capital, was growing this business on the path to profitability and to an IPO. And then while they were getting ready for the IPO, someone put together that this Damien Patton was that Damien Patton, who 20 years earlier had been a part of this crime. And he was outed or exposed. And literally within days, he went from the founder of a pre-IPO internet company to the terminated executive, kicked out of his own company by the board. So I was connected with him right while that was beginning to unravel. And I did a Zoom with him. And to be honest, he was sort of glassy-eyed and in shock, trying to sort out what had just happened to him. Now, he had left his white supremacist past behind. But now it had caught up with him, and he'd never owned up to it, Joel, right? So it totally grabbed him. And he quickly lost his job, lost his shares, lost his network, lost his friends. But he had me. So we did a Zoom, and that led to another Zoom, and that led to another call, and another call, and another call, and another call, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another. And those calls became weekly calls I did with Damien every Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern. And I did those calls because I found someone in tremendous pain who needed help. And at ADL, I don't believe in cancel culture. Let me say that really clearly. Because this has been an issue in lots of universities, right, across the country. Cancel culture, where someone makes a mistake, someone transgresses, and they're canceled. At the ADL, we believe in counsel culture. Counsel culture. Now, that's not my term. I got that term from my friend Nick Cannon, who himself had an issue, which you can talk about if you want. But basically, my Jewish faith has this idea called teshuvah, which is this notion of repentance, which is this acknowledgement that we're all human and we're maybe created in the image of God, but we're not God. We all make mistakes. And so as the head of the ADL, I think it is my obligation not to sort of eject the sinner, but to embrace the sinner. And that's what I did with Damien. And the God's honest truth, like those weeks became months and those months became years. And Damien has become a very dear friend. Because he's a decent human being, going through the kind of pain that, look, he's got to be accountable for what he did, but we've also got to recognize that everyone can change. And that's the ethos we try to practice at ADL. And I have learned from people like Damian Patton, from people like Nick Cannon, from so many others about the power of forgiveness and the necessity of grace. And I think this is something that is like lost in our hyper-polarized, super atomized society where everyone is ready to grab everybody by the throat at the drop of a hat. We all could benefit from a little more grace. And so I try to exhibit that value at ADL.
I see a lot of questions coming to my friend Moss Blackman, so I'm going to turn to that in a minute, but I want to turn the conversation for a minute. This is a perfect moment to do it.
Okay.
Talk about hope in a couple of different ways. Earlier today, at the Big Apple, which is a sacred space in our community, a former synagogue turned a black nightclub in the 1950s, you had a conversation with Julian Williams, our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, with Audrey Korsgaard, the Chair of our Faculty Senate. And one of the central themes of that conversation this afternoon was about hope. So what gives you hope amidst all of the things that you've talked about this evening?
That's a really good question. So what gives me hope? There are a few things. So look, first of all, I have tremendous faith in this country. So I am someone, I'll just tell you flat out, and I don't think this is fashionable to say in all kinds of places, but like I am someone who deeply believes in American exceptionalism. I think this is the greatest democracy in the history of humanity. And I think for all of its flaws, and it's got plenty, for all of its problems, and it's got plenty, the notion of a country founded on an ideal with a desire, I mean, it says it in our founding documents, to create a more perfect union. It's an acknowledgement, again, of the fact that we are a work in progress. And this country has come through global conflict, civil unrest, economic calamity, pandemic. And here we are. Hineni. And that gives me tremendous hope that we too can come through this moment. I really believe that. And I just look at the last elections, where all these ridiculous election deniers were trounced in almost every election across the country. Like, I have tremendous faith in the American people. I also have a lot of faith in the younger generation. They are more tolerant, they are more worldly, and they are more adaptive than my generation. They give me tremendous hope as well. And then the last thing I would say is, what gives me tremendous hope? Like a night like this. Look at this room. There are lots of other ways you could spend your evening. But the fact that so many people come out for a night like this, to hear someone like me, shows me that you have a community here in Columbia that cares deeply and is willing to invest their energies and their resources in creating a better world. And that, to me, is incredibly encouraging and inspiring.
This is an extraordinary community. It's one that I joined 18 years ago, having never visited this state until I came to interview here, and it's become very much my home in ways that I can't even fathom. The town where I grew up, which happens to be Washington, D.C.
Oh, you grew up in D.C.?
I grew up in D.C., actual D.C.
It's a nice town.
It has its moments. What are the kinds of things that communities, either at the community level, through organizations, or at the individual level, can do to help turn the tide?
So I get asked this question a lot, like what can kind of individuals do? So let's talk about that for a minute, if I might, Joel. Because I think communities are just collections of individuals, right? That have these bonds, that have these shared ties. So at the individual level, there's a kind of heuristic I use in the book. I mentioned it, I think, earlier today. So we talk about what can you do? You can remember, this can be a takeaway after you've done your ChatGPT homework assignment. Speak up, share facts, show strength. Number one, speak up. So all of us have the power, all of us have the capacity, no matter how old you are, what is your station in life, what's your degree of education, to say something when we see something. Whether it's, flagging a nasty, horrendous tweet, or tagging, an ugly post on Facebook, or engaging someone when they make, a racist joke, or interrupting someone at the water cooler. Do we still have water coolers? Or, on the playing field, or over the bridge game, or at the dinner table when they say something that's just racist or anti-Semitic and wrong. Now you got to calibrate appropriately, right? But all of us have the ability to interrupt intolerance when it happens. Don't underestimate that power. Don't discount the capacity of all of us to stop hate when it happens. And by the way, if you are a so-called progressive, say something when you see it among your liberal friends. If you're a so-called self-identified conservative, say something when you see it among your conservative friends. I think it's really important that we recognize that we all have to be accountable to a higher power, not just to the red team or the blue team that we think we play for. So number one, speak up. Number two, share facts. What I mean by this is we've all got to dial down the drama. We've all got to ratchet down the rhetoric. We all can seek to calm things and bring people in rather than cast them out. And read up. Get smart. Don't repeat something because you saw it on Newsmax, for God's sakes. I mean it. Right? All of us can get literate and smart about things and try to take an evidence-based approach. So number one, speak up. Number two, share facts. Number three, and maybe this is most important, show strength. Fighting hate. Democracy is not a spectator sport. You don't get to watch it from the cheap seats and assume you know how the game ends. We don't. Democracy is not a foregone conclusion. This gift that we have, this democracy, it's delicate and fragile. We've got to work at preserving it. That means we got to lean in. That means we got to show up. That means we got to stick around. That means we've got to be an ally for others. And I said this afternoon with Julian. Anti-black racism isn't just the problem of black people. It's the problem of white people, too. Anti-Semitism isn't just a Jewish problem. It's a problem for non-Jewish people, too. All of us have to recognize the shared stake that we have in fighting hate. So showing strength is about realizing that democracy is a contact sport, and we all got to get on the freaking field and be ready to play. All right.
Here they come.
Moss has spoken.
I will say William Hubbard will not let me live it down if we're here and we talk about democracy and he and I don't also talk about the rule of law and the slippage of the rule of law here in the United States and around the world and the consequences of that as well.
Look, yeah, the rule of law is the idea that because you're elected to office, you somehow don't have to abide by the basics like the rest of us. You saw the unraveling of the rule of law when you had those people rampaging through the Capitol, and then you had legislators claiming that it was a peaceful demonstration, right? The rule of law is, it's interesting, actually. So we think about, I think, institutions. We think about Washington, D.C. as these it's the Washington Monument, and it's these big kind of ionic columns and these white marble buildings. No, actually. There are those buildings, but our democracy is not about that. It's about the kind of invisible firmament that holds those buildings together. It's about like the rule of law. And it's about a shared set of values. That's what makes our democracy work. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I think we've got to keep that in mind all the time.
Our first question is from a student. It says, with legislation about anti-Semitism working its way through the South Carolina State House, what is the best way for me and for other students to advocate and show the legislators how important this is? What's the role of students?
How many people in the audience are students? Raise your hand. Look, I will say this, like, the students in the room, you are literally the most powerful people in this place. Your capacity for impact is limitless. And you shouldn't underestimate it, not for a hot second. So what's my advice to the students in the audience? Show up and stick around. I mean, what a blessing to be going to school just like a football throw away from the Capitol building. Like, those members, those legislators, they can't help but take the meeting with you. So you can write those emails, you can submit those letters, you can knock on those doors. But your capacity to organize is unimaginable. And I think it's like your superpower. So what would I say to the students? Use your superpower. Use your superpower. Get organized, show up, and stick around.
Next question says, some incidents that are labeled as anti-Semitic are really criticism of Israel. It seems that there is no distinction at times between the two. What, in your opinion, is a non-anti-Semitic criticism of Israel?
It's a good question. So if you're looking for criticism of Israel that isn't anti-Semitic, I have a website I want to point you to. You guys should write this down. This is going to be a long one. Okay? It's adl.org. The idea that you can't criticize Israel without being called anti-Semitic is a fiction. It's a red herring. Now look, I'm not going to lie. There are some people who might claim that everything is anti-Semitic. The phase of the moon, the taste of the water. But the reality is, look, I am a proud, unapologetic Zionist. Make no mistake. Zionism is the belief in the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. And my Zionism compels me to criticize policies of the state of Israel when I think they get it wrong. Like my patriotism compels me to criticize policies of the United States of America when I think it gets it wrong. There's nothing incompatible with my Zionism, my ability to criticize the government of Israel when I think it does something inappropriate or untoward. But there's something deeply different with criticizing a policy and delegitimizing a country. There's something profoundly different with saying, I think President Trump got it wrong, therefore destroy the United States of America. Look, as I've already said in this talk, there's plenty of things, plenty of imperfections in this country. It's a country that started with the genocide of the indigenous natives who were once here. Our economy in colonial America and in the early industrial America was built on the back of enslaved Africans. We got a lot of work to do. And some of those sins, I don't know if you can ever make up for them. But let's realize that this is a country which still seeks to get it right and still has a long way to go. So too with the state of Israel. So too with every other country on the planet Earth. And so, the question would be not, why is the criticism of Israel always called anti-Semitic? The question is Israel the only country that you seek to criticize? Are Israelis the only people that you dehumanize? Is the Jewish state the only one that you think is illegitimate? Are you holding the country to double standards that you're not applying to I don't know, China, Russia, and I could go on and on and on. So if you are applying double standards, delegitimizing, demonizing one country in the world, the country's not the problem. You probably are. Now let me say one last thing about all that. I say this as someone who ferociously will fight for a two-state solution, who believes Israelis need safety and security and Palestinians need equality and fair treatment in a state of their own. I believe that. I believe Israel will never have peace unless the Israeli-Palestinian issue is resolved. But if you believe that the only problem is the Jewish state of Israel, you just might be the problem.
This question is a bit of a gear shift. My colleagues in the Department of Statistics, which falls in the College of Arts and Sciences, would be proud of this question.
All right.
Do you think the numbers of anti-Semitism events grew perhaps in part because we measure and collect reports better, because the data collection is better? Or were the numbers always high? I mean, what might data collection have done in that space?
There's no doubt that we have put a huge emphasis on collecting the data, because as I said before, if you don't, you can't manage what you don't measure. So you need to understand the problem set in order to try to solve the problem, its size, its scope, everything. So I think to some degree one could postulate that the increase in numbers can be somewhat attributed to better reporting. That's probably true. To what degree, I couldn't tell you, and it certainly does not account for the massive surge that we've seen. And I say that with full faith in the empiricism of our work, but I also just say, like, anecdotally, right? So the anecdotes are not a data-driven approach, but they often can help to humanize the statistics. They can give you a kind of insight on the numbers. I got interrupted. We were at lunch today. Where's Joel? Joel was hosting us for lunch today. Way in the back. Way in the back so I don't call on you. I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing. And I got interrupted by a call about a shooting in Los Angeles of a Jewish man in the Pico Robertson neighborhood, the heavy Jewish neighborhood. That's on the heels of a shooting yesterday morning of a Jewish man in the same neighborhood coming out of a synagogue. That's on the heels of a Molotov cocktail being thrown at a synagogue in New Jersey last month. And I could go on and on with these kinds of stories. So can I tell you with certainty that those incidents were all anti-Semitic? Molotov cocktail at a synagogue, probably. I'm not so sure about the shootings. But again, as I was saying earlier, at some point you realize these aren't, random. It's not a random scatter plot. These are data points on a trend.
Yeah. And I would say also, when you have that kind of growth in a 6-year period from 2015 to 2020, you're not talking 1985 to 2021 where data collection has changed significantly or you've learned that much more. I mean, you're really talking about a very tight time frame there.
And look, it's interesting because if you look at, we do some attitudinal research as well, the Jewish community, and so do my friends at the American Jewish Committee. And there's a reason why I go to college campuses and I talk to Jewish students. And look, I mean, again, 100 years ago, Jews couldn't attend many universities. Maybe this one, I'm not sure. But the reality is Jews can attend any university they want. Any university in the United States. If you got the grades, you got the scores, you can get in, you can study, and you can have a terrific academic experience. But I hear from, I'm an alum of Tufts and Northwestern. And in both those schools, I've heard directly from students who tell me, I remember hearing this from Tufts students. They said, that's crazy. They said, Jewish on campus, not a problem. I just can't get involved in Hillel. I said, Hillel? They said, well, I could go to service. For those who don't know, Hillel is the Jewish student organization on campus. They said, well, I can go to Hillel now and then, but I definitely can't be involved. Why not? They said, well, then people will think I'm part of this is a quote, the Israeli war machine. I'm sorry. When Hillel is not much of an Israeli war machine. There are not a lot of machines going on at Hillel. They're trying to do Havdalah services, for God's sakes. But that's scary. And so they basically said, look, I can be Jewish on campus as long as I keep my head down. As long, and We have mezuzahs being ripped off the doors of students. We have Hillels and Jewish fraternities being vandalized with swastikas. We have all this kind of stuff. Campuses all over the country. And so I think there's a degree of anxiety in our community which reflects the fact that something's going on and it's not just better reporting.
Look, I will share that in my first semester as interim dean, a report came to me of a student wearing a sweater with a swastika on it in a large lecture class here on this campus. This is 2 years ago. The student had reported it to our director of Hillel, who had reached out to me. The student was a freshman and wanted to remain anonymous because they were concerned about the repercussions of this coming out. Their concern, believe it or not, was not the sweater. It was that when they approached their professor to express concern, the professor's response was, that's protected free speech. It is not, in fact, protected free speech. And we had to work very hard. I had to work very hard to think about how I have two of my colleagues, Lacey Ford and Marian Fitzpatrick, are probably thinking, thank God I wasn't in the seat on that day, and yet we're thinking I dealt with the same things. And how do we address that problem without identifying the student? And we had a larger education effort within the whole department to bring together 5 or 6 topics so that we could address that topic, but not identify the student along the way. That happened here within the last 2 years.
So how did you address that as an incident that didn't involve free speech? How did you help me and help us understand how you kind of, describe that?
Well, I mean, we talked about it. Well, first of all, we relied on outside experts. Mm-hmm. We brought in experts who understand the law in that space. Mm-hmm. And we talked about, again, a variety of different free speech issues and identified that which is and that which is not, that which is protected. And also, we relied on talking about what federal laws mandate in a space that receives federal dollars from the federal government. And we did it in a way that addressed not a single group or a single action, but that really was about trying to get a dialogue happening among the faculty and graduate students in that department who also teach. Mm. Interestingly, I'll share, without getting too much detail, I was certain when it came out that it had to be a graduate student. In my head, it just went to that. It's someone who doesn't know enough. And it turned out it was one of my most senior faculty in that department. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, these are challenging issues. An organization like ADL, which was founded, again, to fight for justice, fair treatment for all, spends a lot of time thinking about the First Amendment. And these are tough issues to navigate, That
one's right on the wall. I mean,
Yeah, it's very hard. But, I have strong views about this. Like, I had a disagreement with the mayor of Charlottesville. Like, I think those people had the right to march in Charlottesville. But the mayor should have had what I'll call the sechel, the common sense. Say maybe they shouldn't march right down the middle of town, which is true. Again, I think in a democracy, even hate speech is the price of free speech. You have to be willing to tolerate things that you detest. And yet, we can still apply some basic modicum of decency and common sense to make sure people can express themselves in a way which doesn't endanger other people. And I think that can be done and needs to be done.
I'm going to ask one last question. It just plays on exactly...
That's it?
Well, I've got more. I mean, she's telling me time is up over there.
Is it?
She's saying, wrap it up.
Oh, all right. Megan,
he'll stay all night. But this is a perfect way to end. Do you have a toolbox for? I had not read this question when I was talking a minute ago. Do you have a toolbox for how to deal with instances of anti-Semitism on university campuses, and how do we deal with anti-Semitism on campus in general?
Well, I don't. So how do you deal with the anti-Semitism in campus? I mean, I won't say that every instance is sui generis, but every instance does need to be looked at, and examined for its own dimensions and such, right? Every instance can be different. That being said, I think there's some simple steps you can think about. So number one, I think universities should adopt what's known as the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. The IRA definition, IRA is an acronym, stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's a panel of experts and scholars from Europe who over the course of 10 or 12 years developed a standardized definition of anti-Semitism. It's not intended to be policy, but it's kind of instructive to try to understand what is anti-Semitism. So number one, you can adopt the definition. Number two, I think it's important to ensure that your DEI training, right, whether it's for faculty and faculty and administrators, or like orientation for freshmen and other students, includes anti-Semitism. I know that, again, anecdotally speaking, I haven't done a systematic analysis, but a lot of DEI programs don't include anti-Semitism. In the corporate world, they don't. In the university world, they often don't. So you can make sure that anti-Semitism is part of the kind of language of inclusion and inclusiveness. Number three, you can make sure you make accommodations for your Jewish students. Like doing lectures on Shabbat? No, not the best. Scheduling an exam on Yom Kippur and then not giving the student the opportunity to retake the exam? Like, these may seem like small things, but they're not. They're actually quite significant, quite consequential. Number four, I think schools can do a good job of like recognizing a Black History Month. And this is Black History Month, and I hope you're all paying attention to that. Or Pride Month and Jewish American Heritage Month. That happens in May. So I don't know if the school has programming for these other months that I'm describing. But if you do, great. And you should do it for Jewish American Heritage Month as well. And then lastly, I think one of the most important things, one of the most valuable things, is the power of participation. Black Jewish Seders, shared service opportunities. There are ways you can build hope by bringing your students and your faculties together in the kind of shared activities they can actually get to know one another. So if you think about adopting the IRA definition, including anti-Semitism or DEI programming, making reasonable accommodations, celebrating Jewish American Heritage Month, and finally, bringing students and faculty together for intergroup, interfaith exercises, all those things I think can be very powerful. Now, again, you have to look at each situation on its own, but I think the goal should be to create a climate of equity and inclusion for Jews. And by the way, I should also just note, because I talked about Black History Month a minute ago and Pride Month, the Jewish community is a multi-ethnic, multiracial community. We should not forget that. There are lots of Jewish people who don't identify or present as white, and we need to recognize their stories as much as we recognize the more, if you will, Ashkenazi stories among us. But that being said, if you can create a climate of inclusion, I think you can handle anything.
I mean, I feel like I just asked a question, you gave an answer. It's like the perfect way to wrap it up in a bow, but I have this question sitting in front of me that I'm burning to ask, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Education and training of law enforcement personnel is useful for some, but we often hear about members of law enforcement who are the actual perpetrators of hatred, white supremacists and otherwise. What can be done to address that?
I'm glad you asked that question, or who asked that question?
I just read it.
Somebody, Moss, you asked.
Was it your question?
Oh, you're kind of a ringer. Come on. We'll let him in. No, look, we have a big problem with extremism in law enforcement. Agnes and I were talking about this earlier in terms of the German parallels. So ADL has been tracking extremists for decades and decades. And for years, white supremacists and right-wing extremists have been with intention, trying to penetrate the military and law enforcement. They do it because they get respect, they get training when they're inside and access to things like ammunition and, best practices. And when they're outside, these people give them a veneer of respectability, an imprimatur, if you will, of legitimacy. So this has been going on for a long time. And by the way, like, the military has had a harder and harder time attracting recruits. There was a time when if you had, Nazi tattoos on your arm, that would disqualify you. Not anymore. They've been much more lax about their recruiting. So we have a problem, and I can give you one very specific example. So this is about a year and a half ago. One of my researchers was on a Signal chat, I believe it was Signal, of the Proud Boys. And some disgruntled member, God bless them, posted, I don't know how they got their hands on it, but posted a file with the entire membership roll of the Proud Boys. Oh, sorry, Oath Keepers. Guess what? My researcher, unbeknownst to them, was on that chat and pulled it down before someone deleted it. 38,000 names. So what did we do with our team of dozens of analysts? We do what we do. We investigated all of those names, 38,000 people. We did public record searches, we did social media searches, we used some other investigative techniques, and we identified thousands of them who were retired and active duty law enforcement, who were retired and active duty military, who were teachers and EMTs and elected officials and political candidates. It was terrifying. And so then what did we do with all that information? We went to local papers in places like, I don't really know if it was relevant here, but like Columbia, South Carolina, and shared those names. So local officials could draw their own conclusions about what to do with those people. Now, I have seen more receptivity from this administration than from any prior. So we're working with the Department of Defense, and we're working with the Department of Justice, and working with Chris Wray and the FBI on trying to put in standards and practices to get these white supremacists out of our military and out of our police department. And we've got to do that. At the same time, there are plenty of people in uniform who are not extremists or white supremacists. And we need those people to understand how a hate crime is different than a regular crime. We need them to understand the support a marginalized community needs after an incident like Buffalo or El Paso or Orlando or Pittsburgh or Poway. I could go on. And so we spend a lot of time trying to give these people the training that they need. And sometimes, just sometimes, it works.
Jonathan, thank you for sharing your unique perspective with us today.
Thank you, Joel. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Before we break up, I have a few other notes of thanks. We started with some thank yous. I want to add a few more. I want to thank the members of the ADL team. I want to thank Gaetan Davidson and Yael Sherman as well for being with us tonight and for all of your work in supporting us. I have a long list. I'd like to thank President Amoritas, who was here with us tonight through the talk. He had to leave to go to the basketball game to watch the Lady Gamecocks take on the Florida Gators. But he was here for the entirety of our talk, and it was very important to him to be here. I want to thank Samuel and Inez Tenenbaum and Melvin and Judith Sherman, Moss Blackman. I want to thank the ADL board member, Joel Lurie, who's been mentioned tonight, Beth Bernstein, our mayor, Daniel Rickenman, who flew straight in from Charlotte and came down here to be with us tonight. I want to thank Dean Hubbard and the entire team from the law school, who are such extraordinary partners to the college, and so many important events are held in this very important space that honors the great Judge Karen Williams. And I want to thank the faculty members on the Solomon Tenenbaum Committee, Myra Muller, the interim director of Jewish Studies, Agnes Mueller, Andrew Burns, and Saskia Conan-Snyder, who, when she returns from sabbatical, will be the next director of Jewish Studies, who I hope many of you know and will get to know. I also want to thank the college's external relations team and communications team for all of their efforts. And finally, I want to end with one note. One of the most important things for this college and this university is to be engaged partners in the community, to be engaged with you in myriad ways, through our students, but with all of you. This is such an important part of what we do. Tonight is such an important part of what we do. But we do many other things that we hope that you'll be part of and engage in. And behind me, probably right now, you're looking behind me to say that we're doing some important programming, and we hope you'll see some of our upcoming programs that you see there. And I especially want to point out that Wendy Lauer will be visiting on March 16th, thanks to the generosity of the Ashik Foundation in Charleston. Community is always invited to these events, and if you're not getting our newsletter, please let us know. Please speak with Megan or me, Saskia Meyer, so that we can get that to you. And please join me one last time in thanking our honored guest, Jonathan Greenblatt. Thank you, Jonathan. There will indeed now be a reception, a book signing, so we ask you to join us out in the parent family lobby for that.